René Descartes is famous for stripping away all of what he thought was true, all of his presuppositions, and attempting to find what he considered objective truth. In this search, he came across something which we call today as René Descartes' theory of proof, or if you don't want to be like me, then Descartes' theory of proof. Descartes' theory of proof says simply that there's three ways to prove something: presuppositional, infinitive, or circular. However, of course, you can also combine these methods in various combinations. Presuppositional is pretty self-explanatory. It's based off of presuppositions that don't exactly have further proof, or are at least assumed for sake of conversation. Circular is also relatively self-explanatory. It is, for example, A, therefore B, and then B, therefore C, and then of course C, therefore A. If you were to draw it out, it would of course make a loop. Infinitive is arguably the most rare of all of these, and is the only one that could be considered objective. Infinitive essentially goes infinitely back in different, however similar, nodes of logic. This is an example of an infinitive proof. From this, we can deduce that there is four main types of logical deduction, or two types of deduction, and four main types of logical reasoning. The two types of deduction are what I would call the Socratic method and the Cartesian method, and the two non-deductive types of reasoning are, of course, inductive, or the Aristotelian method, and using intuition. In this video, we will attempt to compare these four different types of reasoning and maybe look at some pros and cons and different uses in modern day life. Let's look at each of these in more detail. Let's start with the Aristotelian or inductive method. This method, as you might have guessed, is based around induction. Well, you might not know what that means, so let me explain. Induction is quite simply to base your presuppositions or to base your reasoning off of observation of the natural world and its phenomena. For example, you might have heard of the theory of relativity. Well, it is a theory. However, the theory is based off of induction. Einstein observed the movement of light. Well, not Einstein, but the way it only became commonly accepted after scientists observed light bending around massive objects such as stars, or later on, with more precise tools, galaxies. So there is a problem with this method, which is actually in the name of the theory of relativity, which is that every result gathered by the inductive Aristotelian method will always be a theory and nothing more than a theory. The reason being is because even though the more you test, the more likely it is, the more that your percentages will be more and more accurate, you still will have a slim probability of it being completely and utterly wrong. So, considering that, it is still extremely important. Let's take an example that is both on the small and large scale. You'll see what I mean. Quantum mechanics is also based off of induction. The double slit experiment, for example, arguably the most famous experiment in modern science. Everybody's throwing it around these days. Hop into any Discord call and you'll hear it at least 10 times in the first minute. Metaphorically, of course. But let's move on. The double slit experiment, of course, was an inductive experiment to see the patterns of photons when shot at, well, double slits. And instead of making the pattern that you would expect, where you'd have two hotspots behind the two slits, it made a pattern like a wave. And this, of course, prompted scientists to conclude that there was some sort of wave involved with this, probability wave. So, considering that most of modern science is based off of this, and yet it's still a theory. It quite obviously has its uses and also does not have, it is also lacking in certain areas for certain aspects. But let's move on. Next, let's cover my two favorite, the two deductive methods. Now, it is important to distinguish between these two methods, but let me just explain what deduction is. So deduction is the process of logical argumentation or logical reasoning, or essentially most things to do with logic. So it's about constructing logical nodes and logical connections and link chains and causal chains and reverse causals, stuff based around that. So the reason why I separate this category into two types is because when you're dealing with an issue, there's two main approaches that you can go about it. You can start from the beginning. You can start with what you two value, what you value. So let's say, let's take gun control, for example. You might value freedom. You might value saving lives. Let's say you value both. You would then construct logical nodes upon those values. So then you would construct a node saying, okay, we should attempt to limit the restrictions of gun control to a minimum. And then from there, you would construct further logical nodes until you build up to your conclusion, which might be any sort of conclusion for gun control. And I don't really want to get into it on this video, so I'm going to end it there. However, the alternative to this, which is essentially the deconstructive method, or the Socratic method, which it is commonly called, would be to start with your conclusion and then ask why, and then why, and then why. Sort of like that annoying child in those TV shows. However, it is still very, very, very important. Both types of them have their benefits and their, we'll say, pitfalls. Last but not least is intuition. Intuition is a funny topic, and people have greatly varying views on how important intuition is. It is very, very, very subjective of a matter. So I don't really particularly want to go into it in too much depth, but in short, there's different theories of where intuition comes from. If you're looking at it from a biological standpoint, of course, it will come from past experiences and your subconscious calculating things, mainly inductively, also deductively, and then presenting you with some sort of intuition that you can use. However, some people will actually argue that intuition will, come from God or is divinely inspired or spiritually inspired, but that's a whole nother topic, again, for a whole nother video. So let's move on to talking about the pros and cons. As a general rule, each of these strategies can be associated with certain sects or certain in-groups of modern U.S. society, or if you want to extrapolate, then also, of course, the world. So, I might as well go around and list them. Of course, the most obvious one of these would be the inductive method, or the Aristotelian, and that's almost synonymous with the scientific method. The scientific method does involve, some deduction, but mostly relies on induction. So, of course, you can associate induction with the scientific community a lot. Now, moving on to deduction, both of these scenarios, deduction is sort of the glue that holds all of these things together, especially Cartesian reasoning. But if we look at Socratic reasoning, then that's also, to an extent, very prevalent in science too, but is more prevalent in fields like, of course, philosophy, Socrates, but also engineering, for example. The deductive method, the constructive deductive method or Cartesian method, of course, is also prevalent in certain philosophical groups, but is even more so than the Socratic method prevalent in engineering due to them having to use equations and having to predict the circumstances and outcomes before they actually happen. Imagine if the engineers who built the bridge that you drove on to get to work used the inductive method and said, let's see if this works, and then if it doesn't, we can build the new bridge. That would not be very effective. Now moving on to the last one of these, intuition. Of course, I would associate intuition with a spiritual philosophical group called mysticism, or sect of philosophy called mysticism, which heavily has to do with one's own experience and can be associated a lot, therefore, with intuition. People like Meister Eckhart, for example, or arguably the most famous mystic in history, Ibn Arabi, of course, sort of talked about relying a lot on intuition, especially Ibn Arabi, actually. At that time, of course, Islamic science was very prevalent, so you can look at multiple discussions that Ibn Arabi has with other philosophers and natural philosophers, i.e. The equivalent of science at that time, and he talks about the benefits of mysticism over induction or deduction. Now, if we were to list the pros and cons of these, as a general rule, these pros and cons can also be identified with the groups that they're used by, because these groups, of course, use them for a reason. So the inductive method, of course, works very, very well, as I've mentioned before in the inductive method section, for observation of the universe and trying to figure out not how it works, but actually the laws that it follows. There's a very big difference. It's essentially the difference between figuring out that pulling a trigger on a gun will shoot the gun and understanding the mechanisms of how that happens. So science is very good at understanding what the safety and the trigger does, but in order to see deeper, so to speak, into the mechanisms of the universe, that's where generally deduction comes in. As a general rule, the Socratic method is used as a sort of tempering mechanism. As you can see here, this is a sort of example of using the Socratic method as a tempering mechanism. You would start with a conclusion, and then you would go back until you hit a presuppositional proof, or until you hit a circular proof, or until you hit a infinitive proof. Unless, of course, you find a logical fallacy, or, of course, you could find a combination of all three of those, or even you could throw in some logical fallacies if you wanted. There's none here, but you could. The deductive method, on the other hand, would be used for constructing conclusions. It's very useful if you have a goal in mind and you have knowledge of sort of the parameters, or at least the baseline to start with, and then constructing from there, or if there's an infinite amount of possibilities that you would need to test if you were to use the inductive or Socratic methods. In addition, it can also be used to find out the mechanisms in which a system works, not just predict the inputs from the outputs. So this is sort of an example of what might be called the we'll go into that in further in later videos, especially when we cover topics about consciousness, the soul, and awareness. But for now, it is very simply very good to try and determine objectively true, or at least objectively true, assuming certain parameters, conditions. Moving on to the last one, last but not least, intuition. I'm not going to cover this one in much detail, considering that I'm going to cover intuition as a whole in a future video. But in short, it's very good as a sort of to trim the fat off of other solutions. So it can be used as a final testing mark on the scientific method, or if you're doing a math problem, then if you get some crazy answer, you should probably check it because your intuition says it's crazy. Or a lot of the time, scientists, I grew up in a pretty science heavy family, but scientists will have an intuitive idea, or engineers will have an intuitive idea about what the solution is, and then sort of have to draw it out, actually further put it on paper later, such as, with Einstein and his lesser known mathematical expert buddy, who I don't even know the name of. But yeah, moving on to the examples. Now I have to put a notification at the end of this video